At 14:23 hours on March 24, 1945, Staff Sergeant Jacob Harlan sat cramped inside the ball turret of a B-17G Flying Fortress named Devil's Advocate at 26,000 feet over Germany, watching the aircraft's shadow race across the snow-covered landscape 5 miles below, while the intercom crackled with routine position reports from the other crew members. Harlan was 22 years old, ball turret gunner with the 390th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force, based at Framlingham, England. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, 140 pounds, the physical requirements for fitting into the ball turret's 44-inch diameter sphere suspended beneath the B-17's fuselage. A coal miner's son from West Virginia who had enlisted in 1943 because underground mining and enclosed spaces didn't frighten him the way they frightened other men. The ball turret was the most vulnerable position on a B-17, a plexiglass and aluminum sphere with 2 .50 caliber machine guns, no armor protection, no room to wear a parachute, accessible only through a hatch in the aircraft's belly. If the B-17 had to make an emergency landing with landing gear up, the ball turret would be crushed on impact with the gunner inside. At 14:24 hours, Harlan heard the aircraft's pilot, First Lieutenant Andrew Callahan, report flak ahead at 12 o'clock level. At 14:25 hours, the first 88mm anti-aircraft shell exploded 60 feet from Devil's Advocate's nose, showering the aircraft with shrapnel. At 14:26 hours, the second shell exploded directly under the cockpit. At 14:27 hours, Lieutenant Callahan started screaming. The B-17G Flying Fortress was the most heavily produced American heavy bomber of World War II, designed to deliver 8,000 pounds of bombs to targets deep in German territory while defending itself with 10 .50 caliber machine guns positioned in 6 turrets and positions. The aircraft's crew consisted of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit at the aircraft's nose, separated by a narrow center console, each with individual flight controls. Standard procedure during combat required both pilots to monitor the controls and coordinate actions. If the pilot was incapacitated, the co-pilot could take over. If both pilots were incapacitated, the aircraft would crash. No other crew member was trained to fly the B-17. The crew's survival depended on at least one pilot remaining functional. Harlan heard Callahan's screams through the intercom at 14:27 hours. The screams were not pain, they were incoherent, animal sounds. No words, just screaming. Then the co-pilot's voice, Second Lieutenant Gregory Moss, shouting, "Callahan's hit! He's fighting the controls!" Then the aircraft began rolling left. Harlan felt the ball turret rotate as the aircraft's orientation changed. The horizon tilted in his plexiglass windows. The B-17 was banking steeply, too steeply for normal flight. Harlan keyed his intercom. "Ball turret to pilot, what's happening?" Moss's voice strained. "Callahan took shrapnel to the head. He's alive, but he's trying to dive the plane. I can't overpower him. He's pushing the yoke forward." The B-17 entered a dive at 14:27 hours and 30 seconds. Harlan watched the altimeter in his turret. 26,000 feet, 25,500 feet, 25,000 feet. The descent rate was 2,000 feet per minute. Too fast. At this rate, the aircraft would reach ground level in 12 minutes, but the B-17's structural limits would be exceeded long before that. The aircraft's maximum dive speed was approximately 350 miles per hour. Beyond that speed, the control surfaces could be torn off by aerodynamic forces. Harlan heard Moss on the intercom. "I can't pull him off the controls. Someone get up here and help me." The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Raymond Delaney, responded immediately. Harlan heard Delaney's boots on the metal floor above the ball turret as the engineer moved forward toward the cockpit. The aircraft was still diving. Altitude, 23,000 feet. The airspeed was building. Harlan could feel it in the increased vibration of the ball turret. At 14:28 hours, Delaney reached the cockpit. Harlan heard Delaney's voice on the intercom. Jesus Christ! His face! There's metal in his head. He's not responding. He's just screaming and pushing forward. Moss, help me pull him back. Sounds of struggle. The aircraft's dive angle steepened. Altitude, 21,000 feet. At 14:29 hours and 40 seconds, Harlan made a decision. He rotated the ball turret to its stowed position, guns pointed straight down, hatch aligned with the aircraft's belly hatch, and climbed out of the turret into the B-17's fuselage. The interior of the bomber was cramped, filled with equipment, ammunition cans, structural bracing. Harlan moved forward through the radio compartment, past the radio operator, Technical Sergeant Louis Brennan, who was monitoring the intercom with a horrified expression. Harlan continued forward through the bomb bay. The bombs had been dropped 10 minutes earlier over the target. The bomb bay was empty. He climbed through the narrow catwalk and reached the forward section of the aircraft. At 14:29 hours, Harlan entered the flight deck area behind the cockpit. He could see Callahan and Moss in their seats. Delaney was standing between them, trying to pull Callahan's hands off the control yoke. Callahan was pushing the yoke forward with both hands, his entire body weight behind it. Moss was pulling back on his own yoke, trying to counter Callahan's input, but the pilot's yoke and co-pilot's yoke were mechanically linked. As long as Callahan pushed forward, Moss couldn't pull back far enough to level the aircraft. The altimeter showed 19,000 feet. The dive was continuing. Harlan looked at Callahan's face. The pilot's eyes were open but unfocused. Blood covered the left side of his face and head. A piece of shrapnel, approximately 2 inches long, protruded from Callahan's left temple, embedded in the skull. The shrapnel had penetrated the temporal bone and was lodged in the pilot's brain. Callahan's mouth was open, screaming continuously. His hands gripped the yoke with inhuman strength. Delaney was pulling on Callahan's shoulders, trying to drag him away from the controls, but Callahan wouldn't let go. Altitude, 17,000 feet. Airspeed, 320 miles per hour and increasing. Moss shouted, "Get him off the controls! We're going to overspeed!" Delaney shouted back, "I can't, he won't let go." Moss, "Hit him! Knock him out!" Delaney punched Callahan in the side of the head. Callahan didn't react. The punch had no effect. The pilot continued screaming and pushing the yoke forward. His brain injury had eliminated pain response and conscious thought. Only the most primitive brain functions remained, and those functions were commanding his body to push the control yoke forward with maximum force. Altitude, 15,000 feet. The aircraft was vibrating severely. The airspeed indicator showed 340 miles per hour, 10 miles per hour from maximum safe speed. Harlan assessed the situation. Callahan could not be reasoned with. He could not be physically restrained. Delaney was stronger than Harlan and had failed to pull Callahan away. Knocking Callahan unconscious had failed. The only way to stop Callahan from pushing the yoke was to make him physically incapable of pushing. Harlan drew his .45 caliber M1911 pistol from the holster on his hip. Every crew member carried a sidearm for use if shot down over enemy territory. Harlan had never fired his pistol except during training. He looked at Callahan, at the pilot's hands locked on the yoke, at the altimeter dropping through 14,000 feet. He made a calculation: 1 pilot's life versus 9 crew members' lives. The mathematics were clear. At 14:30 hours and 12 seconds, Harlan pointed the .45 pistol at the back of Lieutenant Callahan's head and fired once. The sound inside the cockpit was deafening, far louder than the engine noise or the wind. The .45 caliber round struck Callahan at the base of the skull, penetrated the brainstem, and exited through the pilot's forehead, shattering the windscreen in front of Callahan's position. Callahan's body went instantly limp. His hands released the control yoke. The pilot was dead before his body slumped forward against the shoulder straps. Moss immediately pulled back on his control yoke. The B-17's nose began to rise. The dive arrested. Altitude 12,800 feet. The aircraft leveled at 12,500 feet. Moss maintained level flight and reduced power, allowing airspeed to decrease to 180 miles per hour, normal cruise speed. The vibration stopped. The aircraft was flying normally. Delaney stared at Harlan. Harlan stared at the pistol in his hand. Moss, focused on flying the aircraft, said without looking back, "Is he gone?" Harlan said, "Yes." Moss, "Get him out of the seat. I need to see forward." Harlan and Delaney unbuckled Callahan's harness and pulled the pilot's body out of the seat, laying it on the floor behind the co-pilot's position. Blood covered the cockpit floor, the control yoke, and the instrument panel. The shattered windscreen let freezing air stream into the cockpit at 160 miles per hour. The temperature at 12,500 feet was minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Moss was now flying with one hand while using the other to shield his face from the wind. If watching a ball turret gunner shoot his own pilot to save the crew hooked you, hit that subscribe button. This is what happens when brain injury turns a pilot into a threat and someone has to make the impossible decision. Back to Harlan. At 14:32 hours and 12 seconds, Harlan keyed the intercom to the entire crew. "Pilot is KIA. I'm flying us home. Everyone stay at your positions." The crew acknowledged. Harlan heard the other gunners' voices: tail gunner Staff Sergeant Dennis O'Reilly, waist gunners Staff Sergeant Paul Henderson and Sergeant Michael Kovacs, confirming they were still at their stations. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant James Wyatt, and navigator, Second Lieutenant Richard Caldwell, were in the nose compartment. All crew members were alive except Callahan. Moss turned the B-17 west toward England. The bomber was 280 miles inside German territory. Flight time to Framlingham, approximately 90 minutes at current speed. The formation of B-17s they had been flying with had continued toward the rally point after dropping their bombs. Devil's Advocate was now alone. A lone B-17 was extremely vulnerable to German fighter attacks. The crew would need to defend the aircraft if attacked. At 14:45 hours, the radio operator, Brennan, received a radio call from another B-17 in the formation asking for Devil's Advocate's status. Moss told Brennan to report that they had sustained damage and were returning to base alone. Brennan transmitted the message. The formation acknowledged. No other B-17s could leave formation to escort them. Formation integrity was critical for defensive fire against German fighters. At 15:03 hours, the tail gunner reported two German Bf-109 fighters approaching from 6 o'clock low, behind and below the B-17. Harlan returned to the ball turret, climbing down through the belly hatch and strapping himself into the cramped sphere. He rotated the turret to face rearward and elevated his guns to cover the lower rear quadrant. The two Bf-109s climbed toward the B-17, closing to 800 yards. At 600 yards, O'Reilly, the tail gunner, opened fire with his twin 50 caliber guns. Harlan waited. The Bf-109 split, one climbing left, one climbing right, attempting to attack from both sides simultaneously. Harlan tracked the right side fighter and opened fire at 400 yards. His tracers arced toward the Bf-109. The fighter broke right and dove away. The left side fighter made a single pass at the B-17's nose, firing its 20mm cannon. Rounds struck the B-17's left wing, punching holes through the aluminum skin but missing critical systems. The fighter broke off and dove away. Both Bf-109s withdrew. They did not return. The German pilots had likely assessed that attacking a lone B-17 with full defensive armament was not worth the risk. At 15:40 hours, Devil's Advocate crossed the English Channel. Moss requested emergency landing clearance at Framlingham due to battle damage and KIA on board. The tower cleared them for immediate landing. At 15:52 hours, Moss brought the B-17 in for landing. The approach was smooth, despite the shattered windscreen forcing Moss to fly with his head turned sideways to see through the co-pilot's side window. The B-17 touched down at 15:53 hours and taxied to the hard stand. The ground crew and medical personnel met the aircraft. Medics entered through the waist door and found Callahan's body on the cockpit floor. The crew disembarked. Harlan climbed out of the ball turret and stood on the tarmac, still holding his .45 pistol. An MP, military police sergeant, approached Harlan and said, "Sir, I need you to give me your sidearm and come with me." Harlan handed over the pistol and followed the MP to the squadron headquarters building. At 16:20 hours, Harlan was questioned by the squadron commander, Major Edwin Thatcher, and the group intelligence officer, Captain Norman Vickers. Thatcher asked Harlan to describe what had happened. Harlan gave a detailed account: the flak hit, Callahan's injury, the uncontrolled dive, the failed attempts to pull Callahan off the controls, his decision to shoot the pilot. Thatcher asked if Harlan had attempted any other method to stop Callahan before shooting. Harlan said Delaney had tried physical restraint and had punched Callahan. Neither worked. The aircraft was accelerating through maximum safe airspeed. Shooting Callahan was the only option that would work fast enough. Thatcher asked if Harlan understood that he had killed a commissioned officer. Harlan said yes. Thatcher asked if Harlan understood the potential consequences. Harlan said he understood he might face court-martial for murder or manslaughter. Thatcher asked why Harlan had shot Callahan anyway. Harlan said, "9 of us or 1 of him." The math was clear. At 1700 hours, the rest of Devil's Advocate's crew was interviewed separately. Each crew member confirmed Harlan's account. Moss stated that Callahan had been pushing the aircraft into a dive that would have killed everyone, and that Harlan's action had saved the aircraft and crew. Delaney stated that he had tried everything possible to stop Callahan and had failed. The other crew members had not witnessed the shooting directly, but had heard it and had seen the aircraft level immediately afterward. At 17:30 hours, the flight surgeon, Captain Howard Finch, examined Callahan's body. The autopsy revealed a 2-inch piece of flak shrapnel embedded in Callahan's left temporal lobe. The shrapnel had penetrated 1.5 inches into the brain tissue, causing massive trauma to the temporal lobe and surrounding areas. Finch's report stated, "The shrapnel injury would have caused immediate loss of higher brain function, including reasoning, speech, and voluntary control. The subject's behavior, screaming and repetitive motor action, is consistent with brainstem function operating without cortical control. The subject was effectively deceased from a cognitive standpoint at the time of secondary injury. Secondary injury, gunshot wound to brainstem, caused immediate cessation of all brain activity and death." At 1800 hours, the 390th Bombardment Group's legal officer, Captain Samuel Morton, reviewed the case and determined that Harlan should be held pending investigation by higher headquarters. Harlan was confined to quarters under MP guard. He was not placed in the brig. Morton determined that Harlan did not pose a flight risk and that the shooting appeared to be a defensive action rather than a criminal act. At 2000 hours, Major Thatcher filed a report with 8th Air Force Headquarters describing the incident and recommending no charges be filed against Harlan. Thatcher's report stated, "Staff Sergeant Harlan acted to preserve the lives of 9 crew members when faced with an immediate threat caused by the pilot's incapacitation. The pilot's brain injury rendered him not a commanding officer but a threat to the crew's survival, and that Harlan's action, while extreme, was necessary and appropriate given the circumstances. Recommend commendation rather than charges." The report went up the chain of command. Over the next 72 hours, it was reviewed by the 390th Bombardment Group Commander, the 13th Combat Bombardment Wing Commander, and finally the 8th Air Force Commander, Lieutenant General James Doolittle. On March 27th, Doolittle's headquarters issued a decision. No charges would be filed. The shooting was determined to be a justifiable action taken in defense of the aircraft and crew. Harlan was released from confinement and returned to duty. The decision was not without controversy. Some officers argued that Harlan should face court-martial for killing an officer regardless of circumstances. The counter-argument was that Callahan's brain injury had rendered him not a commanding officer but a threat to the crew's survival, and that Harlan had acted appropriately to neutralize that threat. Doolittle's decision favored the latter interpretation. Harlan flew his next combat mission on March 30, 1945. The crew of Devil's Advocate had been reassigned to a different B-17. Their original aircraft was too damaged to repair quickly. The new crew configuration had Second Lieutenant Moss as pilot and a replacement co-pilot. Harlan remained as ball turret gunner. The crew flew together for the remainder of the war, 6 more combat missions before Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. Harlan received no medal for the March 24th incident, no commendation. The official record stated that Lieutenant Callahan had been killed in action by enemy flak and that the crew had successfully returned the damaged aircraft to base. The shooting was documented in classified reports but not in public records. The Army Air Forces decided that publicizing the incident would be harmful to morale. The idea that crew members might shoot their own pilots could undermine trust and cohesion. Callahan's family was informed that he had died from injuries sustained during combat operations. They were not told about the shooting. Callahan was buried with full military honors in his hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota. His gravestone reads, First Lieutenant Andrew J. Callahan, United States Air Forces, killed in action, March 24, 1945. Harlan was honorably discharged in October 1945 and returned to West Virginia. He worked in coal mines for 3 years before taking a job as a machinist in a steel mill. He married in 1948 and had 2 children. He never discussed the March 24th incident with his family. His wife knew he had served as a ball turret gunner, but knew nothing about shooting his pilot. Harlan's service records were sealed, classified due to the sensitive nature of the incident. In 1978, a military historian researching 8th Air Force operations requested access to classified mission reports. The March 24, 1945 incident report was declassified as part of this request. The historian contacted Harlan and asked for an interview. Harlan declined. The historian published a brief mention of the incident in his book, describing it as an extreme example of crew resourcefulness during combat emergency. In 1992, a journalist writing about moral decisions in combat contacted Harlan and requested a detailed interview. Harlan agreed on the condition that the interview would not be published until after his death. The interview was conducted on June 15, 1992. Harlan, then 69 years old, described the incident in detail. When asked how he felt about shooting Callahan, Harlan said, "I think about it every day. I killed a man who was a friend, a good pilot, but his brain was destroyed by that shrapnel. The man I shot wasn't Lieutenant Callahan anymore. It was just a body doing things that would kill us all. I did what had to be done. That doesn't make it easier to live with." Harlan died in 2003 at age 80. The interview was published in 2004 in a military history journal. The publication renewed debate about the ethics of Harlan's action. Some argued he had committed murder. Others argued he had saved 9 lives through necessary action. The debate continued in military ethics courses and historical discussions. The crew members of Devil's Advocate supported Harlan throughout their lives. Moss, the co-pilot who had been saved by Harlan's action, remained in contact with Harlan until Harlan's death. In a 2005 interview, Moss stated, "Jake Harlan saved my life and the lives of 9 other men. People who weren't there don't understand. Callahan was already dead from that brain injury. He just hadn't stopped moving yet. Jake did what none of us could do. He made the hard choice." Modern military training includes the March 24th incident as a case study in command decision-making under extreme circumstances. The lesson taught is that crew members may need to take action against their own chain of command when that chain of command becomes a threat due to incapacitation. The training emphasizes that such actions should be last resort only after all other options have failed, and should be taken only to preserve life. The mathematical reality of Harlan's decision remains stark: 1 pilot's life versus 9 crew members' lives. The B-17 was diving at 2,000 feet per minute toward structural failure and crash. Callahan's brain injury had eliminated the possibility of recovery or reasoning. Delaney had attempted physical intervention and failed. Moss could not overpower Callahan's control inputs. The aircraft was seconds from exceeding maximum safe airspeed. Harlan had calculated that shooting Callahan was the only action that would work fast enough to prevent the crash. The calculation was correct. All 9 surviving crew members returned home. Lieutenant Callahan died at 14:30 hours on March 24, 1945, from a gunshot wound inflicted by his own crew member. The cause of that wound was a piece of German flak that had destroyed Callahan's ability to think, to reason, to recognize that he was killing his crew. The real killer was the flak. Harlan's bullet was just the mechanism that stopped Callahan's body from continuing to execute commands from a brain that no longer functioned. 1 trigger pull, 1 dead pilot, 9 lives saved, and the knowledge that doing the right thing doesn't mean it stops hurting.